My name is Hattie Garza, and I'm a 27-year-old specialist in the United States Army. I was on my knees on a training mat at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, trying to breathe while my ribs screamed. Minutes earlier, my stepfather, Sergeant Patrick Monroe, had used his knee to teach me a lesson in resilience in front of my entire unit. Now, my mother, Lisa, stood before me, not with a helping hand, but with a warm plate of casserole. She pressed it into my hands, her voice a desperate whisper. "Hattie, honey, Patrick said it was an accident. You can't report this. You'll ruin his career, you'll ruin our family." Her eyes met mine, not with love, but with fear for the man who had hurt me. She was begging me to protect her monster. They thought the physical pain was the worst part. They were wrong. If you want to know what happens when a daughter is betrayed by her own mother, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and get ready for a story about justice paid for in scars. The air in the combatives' training room at Fort Liberty always tasted the same. A thick metallic cocktail of sweat, vulcanized rubber, and a familiar, low-grade fear. It was the smell of controlled violence, of bodies pushed to their breaking point. For most soldiers, it was just another part of the job. For me, it was the smell of dread. I stood in formation on the gray mats, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic, trapped rhythm. I kept my eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of my combat boots, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. But I knew it was useless. I could feel his eyes on me. Sergeant Patrick Monroe, my stepfather, stood at the front of the room, his posture radiating an authority that went far beyond his rank. To the others, he was a decorated soldier, a man forged in the fires of deployment, a leader who demanded excellence. But I saw the predator beneath the uniform. I had seen it for 16 years. His gaze swept over the platoon, and for a terrifying second, I allowed myself a flicker of hope that it would pass over me. It never did. "Garza, front and center!" His voice boomed across the gymnasium, sharp and absolute. It wasn't just the command of a superior officer, it was the call of a hunter who had singled out his prey. A collective, silent tension rippled through the soldiers around me. They knew. They always knew. I felt dozens of pairs of eyes on my back as I stepped out of line, each glance a tiny pinprick against my skin. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through cement. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but in the army, you don't run. You obey. I walked the long 10 yards to the center of the mat, acutely aware that this wasn't a training exercise. This was a performance, a demonstration of power, and I was the prop. "Today, we're demonstrating a controlled takedown," Patrick announced to the room, but his eyes never left mine. They were cold, flat, and held a glint of something ugly. "It's about leverage and technique, not brute force. Specialist Garza will assist." He moved before I could brace myself. His movements were too fast, too fluid, blurring with an intentional violence that had no place in a controlled demonstration. He grabbed my right arm, his fingers digging into my bicep like claws. Instead of a careful, technical armbar, he twisted my shoulder with a vicious, malicious wrench. A hot, searing pain shot from my shoulder down to my fingertips, and a gasp escaped my lips. I tried to pull back, to find my footing, but he was already a step ahead. Before the first wave of pain had even crested, he spun. His legs swung out, not as a sweep, but as a direct, brutal kick. The steel toe of his boot connected with my left side, right below my ribcage. Crack. The sound was sickeningly dry, an awful, intimate noise that seemed to echo in the sudden, dead silence of the room. All the air was violently punched from my lungs. My world compressed into a single, blinding point of agony. The floor rushed up to meet me, the gray mat a cold, indifferent witness. I crumpled, gasping like a fish on a dock, my vision tunneling to black at the edges. The only other sound was a low, satisfied chuckle from above me. His chuckle. Through the haze of pain, I saw a shape move. PFC. Evans, a young soldier barely out of basic training, took a hesitant step forward, his face a mask of alarm. "Sergeant, should I—" Patrick didn't even look at him. He simply raised a hand, a gesture that stopped the boy in his tracks. "Let her get up on her own." Patrick's voice was calm, instructional, as if he were explaining a fine point of military strategy. Pain builds character. That sentence landed harder than the kick. It was a line he'd used my entire life, a justification for every cruelty, big and small. Across the room, I saw our platoon medic, a decent guy named Tyler, standing frozen. His face had gone pale, his medical training clearly telling him something was seriously wrong. But all it took was one sharp, dismissive glare from Patrick, and Tyler's shoulders slumped. He looked away, busying himself with his aid bag, becoming just another face in the silent, complicit crowd. The silence in that room was its own form of violence. It was a heavy blanket, suffocating me more than the lack of air in my lungs. It was the confirmation of a terrible truth. Here, his power was absolute. Here, no one would step in. No one would protect me. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to push myself onto my hands and knees, each movement sending fresh waves of fire through my side. The training session was dismissed a few minutes later, the soldiers filing out quietly, their eyes avoiding mine. They left me in the echoing silence of the gym, alone with him. Patrick waited until the last person was gone before he walked over and hauled me to my feet by my good arm. He dragged me into a corner, out of sight of the doorway. "Don't you ever embarrass me with that kind of weakness again," he hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like stale coffee and rage. "This platoon needs to see strength, not that." He gestured dismissively at my broken state. I could only stare at the wall behind him, focusing on a crack in the paint, trying to dissociate from the searing pain in my side and the cold dread in my stomach. "And let's be perfectly clear," he continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This was an internal matter, a training mishap. That medic, Tyler, he's going to write it up as a minor collision. Do you understand me, specialist?" He put a cruel emphasis on my rank, a stark reminder of the chain of command, of the power he held over my entire career, my entire life. In this world he had built around me, he was the law. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the humiliation, the absolute powerlessness, that was truly breaking me. I could do nothing but nod. My throat was too tight to speak. As I nodded, a single agonizing question began to form in the deepest, most wounded part of my soul. A question that had been buried for years under layers of fear and survival. Why? Why do I keep letting this happen? Back in the sterile quiet of my barracks room, I peeled off my uniform, the rough fabric scraping against my bruised skin. The sharp pain in my side was a familiar echo, a physical reminder of a deeper, older ache that had settled in my bones long ago. It pulled me back through time, back to the small house in rural North Carolina where the laughter had died. Back to the day Sergeant Patrick Monroe marched into our lives, just 6 months after we buried my father. Before Patrick, our house had been filled with light and noise. My dad, Sergeant Daniel Garza, had a booming laugh that could shake the windows and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. He smelled like sawdust and Old Spice. He taught me how to change the oil in a car and how to bait a fishing hook. Even after he was killed in Afghanistan, the memory of his warmth lingered in the rooms. But when Patrick arrived, he brought a chilling silence with him. He was my mother's fresh start. For me, he was the end of everything. The easy comfort of our home vanished overnight, replaced by the rigid structure of a military outpost. Everything became a drill. Mopping the kitchen floor wasn't a chore. It was a timed evolution. If I was 1 second over the allotted time, I'd be on the floor doing push-ups until my arms gave out. My mother, Lisa, would just stand there, her face a blank mask, nodding as if this were all perfectly normal. "Discipline will save your life one day, Hattie," Patrick would say, his voice devoid of any warmth. And my mother would echo him with a hollow, "He's right, honey. He knows what's best." She was disappearing right before my eyes, fading into his shadow. The first time he hit me, I was 12. I was helping with the dishes, and a soapy plate slipped from my grasp, shattering on the linoleum floor. Before the sound had even faded, His hand cracked across my face. The shock was more stunning than the pain. It wasn't a slap of anger, hot and impulsive. It was cold, deliberate, and methodical. A lesson. This, he said, his voice level, is the consequence of carelessness. I stood there trembling, my cheek stinging, watching him as he calmly got the broom and dustpan. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The next morning, I saw my mother at her vanity, carefully applying concealer to her own cheek, covering a faint purplish bruise that hadn't been there the night before. She must have said something to him after I went to bed. She must have tried. I was careless and slipped on the stairs, she said, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the mirror. She wouldn't look at me. She couldn't. And in that moment, I knew. Her lie wasn't for her, it was for him. It was a shield to protect him from the truth of what he was. My mother had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. Her silence became a language I learned to speak fluently, a language of survival in a home that no longer felt safe. The ultimate betrayal, the one that carved the deepest scar, came on my 16th birthday. For months, I had been saving every dollar I earned from my part-time job at the local diner. I'd saved up just enough for a simple, navy blue dress for the spring formal. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I loved the way the fabric felt, the way it moved when I twirled in front of my bedroom mirror. For a few minutes, I felt like a normal teenage girl. I made the mistake of showing my mother. She was in the living room when Patrick walked in. He took one look at the dress I was holding up against myself, a proud smile on my face. His lip curled in disgust. He walked over, snatched it from my hands, and with two swift, brutal motions, he ripped it from the neckline down to the hem. The sound of tearing fabric was the sound of my heart breaking. "This is not appropriate for a soldier's daughter," he declared, tossing the ruined pieces onto the floor. I looked at my mother, my eyes pleading, expecting her to finally stand up for me, to say something, anything. Instead, she knelt and picked up the shredded fabric, avoiding my gaze. "Patrick just wants what's best for you, Hattie," she said, her voice soft and placating. "That dress? It looked a little cheap anyway. Let me buy you something more suitable." Her words were 1,000 times more painful than the sound of the dress ripping. Cheap. She had sided with him, validated his cruelty, and insulted my pride all in one breath. The more suitable outfit she bought was a khaki A-line skirt and a stiff white button-down shirt. It was practically a uniform. I looked more like I was attending a court-martial than my spring formal. I went to the dance, but I spent most of the night hiding in the girls' bathroom, the shame and hurt a heavy weight in my chest. I thought joining the army would be my escape. The day I graduated from high school, I stood tall in my cap and gown, my enlistment papers a declaration of independence in my pocket. I had a plan. I would leave this town, leave this house, and never look back. But even then, he wouldn't let me go. During the celebration afterward, as my mother snapped photos with a bright, false smile plastered on her face, Patrick pulled me into a hug. It wasn't a hug of congratulations. It was a hug of possession. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper in my ear, meant only for me. "You can go wherever you want, but you remember this. I made you. You will never, ever be free of me." His words landed like a prison sentence. I looked over his shoulder at my mother, who was beaming, oblivious, capturing a happy family moment. It was then that the horrifying truth settled in my gut. The army wasn't an escape. It was just a bigger cage, with the same warden holding the key. If you've ever felt like your own parent was on the wrong side, that they chose to protect your abuser instead of you, please support this story with a like. And in the comments, just type, "I see you, Hattie." Because for years, I felt completely invisible. That feeling of being trapped, of being owned, followed me all the way to basic training, to my first duty station, and now, here. It was the answer to the question that had been screaming in my mind since the training room floor. Why did I let this happen? Because some part of me, the scared 12-year-old girl inside, still believed his final whisper, that I could never truly be free. Before Patrick was transferred to Fort Liberty, I had carved out a life for myself. It wasn't a grand life, but it was mine, built piece by piece with a quiet, stubborn determination. For 3 years, I had known a fragile peace. My world was the vast, sprawling logistics warehouse, a cathedral of cardboard and steel where I found a sense of order that my childhood had lacked. As a logistics specialist, my job was precision. I managed a multi-million-dollar inventory of everything from engine parts to medical supplies. I knew the location of every single item, the weight of every crate, the destination of every shipment. There was a rhythm to it, a logic that I could control. In the chaos of the military, I had created my own island of competence. And for the first time in my life, I was seen for what I could do, not for who I belonged to. People respected me. My direct superior, First Sergeant Alvarez, a kind, no-nonsense Latino man with salt and pepper hair and deep-set, observant eyes, was the first authority figure who ever made me feel valued. He'd often stop by my station, review my immaculate inventory reports, and nod with genuine approval. "Garza," he said to me once, a rare smile touching his lips, "you have the mind of a general." That simple compliment landed in my soul like a cool drink of water in a desert. It was external validation, yes, but it affirmed something I was just beginning to believe about myself. I was good at something. My worth wasn't tied to my ability to endure pain, it was rooted in my intelligence and my diligence. A quiet pride began to grow in the spaces where fear used to live. This newfound sense of self extended beyond the warehouse. I had my own apartment, a small one-bedroom place off base in Fayetteville. It was the first truly safe space I had ever known. The four walls weren't just drywall and paint, they were a fortress. I spent a whole weekend painting the living room a soft, calming mint green. I bought a Boston fern and hung it in the window, and I learned to take pride in keeping it alive. The silence in that apartment was a luxury. Growing up, silence had been a weapon, a heavy, tense precursor to an explosion. But here, in my own home, the silence was freedom. Every evening after work, I would change into civilian clothes, make myself a cup of chamomile tea with a little honey, and sit by the window to read. I worked my way through stacks of novels from the public library, losing myself in other people's stories. I was learning to simply be, to exist without being on high alert, without waiting for the next footstep in the hall, the next barked command. The constant tension that had coiled in my shoulders for years began to slowly, cautiously unwind. I even made a friend. Her name was Sarah, another specialist who worked in the motor pool. She was my polar opposite, loud, cheerful, and refreshingly direct. She knew nothing of my past, and she never asked. To her, I was just Garza, the quiet logistics nerd who was always too serious. "You gotta learn to smile, Garza," she'd tease me, poking me in the ribs. "It won't break your face, I promise." On weekends, she'd drag me out of my quiet apartment to a local diner, a place that smelled of frying oil and coffee and felt like a hug. We'd sit in a vinyl booth and order plates of Southern fried chicken, so crispy and perfect, with fluffy buttermilk biscuits and gravy. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, about stupid lieutenants, about the terrible instant coffee in the mess hall, about her dreams of opening a mechanic shop back home in Georgia. With Sarah, I felt a flicker of the normal, easygoing girl I might have been. That simple, uncomplicated friendship was a powerful medicine, showing me a version of myself I never knew existed. But the peace was always fragile. The shadow of my family was long, and it only took a phone call to remind me of it. One Tuesday night, my mother called. The conversation was short, superficial. She asked if I was eating enough. She told me the weather was getting colder. She mentioned Patrick got a commendation. Her voice was strained, distant, the voice of a stranger making polite conversation. She never asked how I was really doing. She never mentioned the past. It was as if the girl with the ripped prom dress had never existed. After I hung up, the quiet of my apartment suddenly felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was empty. The crushing weight of a profound loneliness settled over me. It was the specific loneliness that comes from knowing the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are incapable of doing so. I opened my laptop, mindlessly scrolling through YouTube, looking for a distraction. I stumbled upon a TED Talk by a researcher named Brené Brown. The title was something about vulnerability. I almost clicked away, but something made me stay. I listened as this warm, funny, incredibly smart woman talked about shame, courage, and the power of being vulnerable. And then she said something that felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. Vulnerability is not weakness, she said. It's our most accurate measurement of courage. The words hung in the air of my quiet, mint green room. Vulnerability is not weakness. My entire life had been an exercise in the opposite, in building walls, in showing no weakness, in never letting anyone see how much I was hurting. Patrick had taught me that vulnerability was a flaw to be beaten out of a person. My mother's actions had taught me it was something to be hidden, to be ashamed of. I stared at the screen for a long time after the video ended. The seed of a new idea had been planted. I wasn't ready to be vulnerable. The thought alone was terrifying. It felt like willingly walking into a fire. But for the first time, I considered the possibility that my carefully constructed armor wasn't strength. It was just a cage. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the quiet Fayetteville street. The streetlights cast a soft orange glow on the empty sidewalk. A question floated in the back of my mind, a quiet whisper that was both terrifying and hopeful. Did I have that kind of courage? Would I ever be brave enough to be seen? That seed of courage, planted by a stranger on a YouTube video, began to be watered by kindness from the most unexpected places. It started with First Sergeant Alvarez. A few weeks after my late-night Brené Brown discovery, he called me into his office. My stomach immediately clenched. Being called into the first sergeant's office usually meant you were in some kind of trouble. I did a quick mental inventory of my recent actions, searching for any infraction. His office was tidy, organized, a reflection of the man himself. He gestured for me to sit, which was another surprise. "Specialist," he began, his voice calm and direct. "I've noticed you've been putting in a lot of late hours. Everything all right?" The question was so simple, so genuinely concerned that it caught me completely off guard. I was used to questions being interrogations, veiled accusations. I mumbled something non-committal about catching up on paperwork. He just nodded, studying my face for a moment. "I was looking over your file," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "I see your father was Sergeant Daniel Garza, 101st Airborne." He paused. "He was a great soldier, a damn good man. I served with him briefly at Fort Campbell before he deployed for the last time." My breath caught in my throat. "He told this story once," Alvarez said, a distant look in his eyes, "about how he fixed the battalion commander's Jeep with nothing but a paperclip and a piece of chewing gum. He had a gift for seeing how things worked." He looked directly at me then, and his gaze was filled with a warmth I hadn't expected. "You have that too, that gift. You see the patterns, you make things work." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping slightly. "My door is always open, Garza, for anything. You understand?" I could only nod, a painful lump forming in my throat. It was the first time an authority figure had ever looked at me and seen my father's daughter, not as a burden or a disappointment, but as a legacy. He saw me as a person, not just a subordinate. I walked out of his office that day feeling seen. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but it was there. The next small act of kindness came from a place I truly never expected. A few days later in the mess hall, my mind was somewhere else, probably replaying Alvarez's words, and my hands fumbled. My entire tray of food, spaghetti, green beans, and a slice of garlic bread, clattered onto the floor in a messy heap. My face burned with instant humiliation. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me as I knelt to clean up the spill, my cheeks flaming. Suddenly, a new tray was placed quietly on the table beside me. I looked up to see the platoon medic, Tyler. The same Tyler who had stood by and done nothing in the training room. His face was full of an emotion I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe? He didn't say much, just gave a small, sympathetic nod. "I got this one," he said quietly, gesturing to the mess on the floor before turning to walk away. That small act, that quiet gesture, spoke volumes. It said, "I know. I'm sorry I was a coward. I'm on your side." It was an apology and an alliance offered on a plastic tray. But the biggest shift came as the holidays approached. Thanksgiving. For me, it was always a day to dread, a stark reminder of the family I didn't have. I was planning on spending it alone in my apartment with a frozen pizza, but Sarah wouldn't have it. "No way, Garza," she'd said, shaking her head emphatically. "You're coming home with me. My parents live an hour away. Mom makes the best pumpkin pie in North Carolina, and Dad will talk your ear off about the 85 Bears. It's happening." I tried to refuse, but she was relentless. So on Thanksgiving morning, I found myself in her car, driving to a small, noisy, chaotic house that smelled like heaven. The moment I walked in, the air was thick with the rich scent of roasting turkey, cinnamon, and sage. Sarah's mom, a bustling woman with a huge smile, enveloped me in a hug that smelled like flour and vanilla. Kids were running underfoot. A football game was blaring on the TV, and the whole house was humming with the cheerful energy of a family that genuinely loved being together. Sarah's dad, a retired master sergeant with a firm handshake and kind eyes, took one look at me standing awkwardly in the entryway and pulled me into a gruff, fatherly embrace. "Welcome to our circus," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest. "In this house, no soldier ever eats a holiday meal alone, ever." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The raw, unconditional acceptance from this stranger, this man who had no reason to care about me, was more than I could handle. I mumbled an excuse and fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I braced my hands on the sink and just sobbed, silent tears streaming down my face. They were tears of gratitude, but also tears of a profound, bottomless grief for the family I should have had, for the father I lost, for the mother who had let me go. The warmth of this strange family's home had melted a piece of the ice that had been frozen around my heart for years, and the pain of the thaw was excruciating. After the holidays, life settled back into its routine, but something in me had changed. I felt less alone. But my fragile peace was about to be shattered. A week later, First Sergeant Alvarez called me back into his office. This time, his expression was serious, his brow furrowed with concern. "Garza, sit down," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I've been hearing some chatter. There's a new sergeant coming in to lead some of the advanced training modules." He paused, looking at a personnel sheet on his desk. "Name's Monroe. Patrick Monroe." He looked up, his eyes searching mine. He asked the question casually, but I could feel the weight behind it. "Any relation?" The air in the room grew cold. My blood felt like it was turning to ice in my veins. My carefully constructed world began to tilt on its axis. "He's my stepfather, First Sergeant," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Alvarez was silent for a long moment, his expression hardening. The kindness in his eyes was replaced by a grim understanding. He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Listen to me very carefully, Garza. Be smart. Be careful," he said. "Fort Liberty is a big place, but sometimes it's a very, very small town." His warning was a lifeline, a confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that the threat was real. But it was also a storm cloud on the horizon, a promise that the monster I had spent years trying to outrun had finally, inevitably, caught up to me. The fragile peace I had built shattered the first time I saw him on base. I was in the gym, my sanctuary, the one place where the rhythm of the treadmill and the burn in my muscles could drown out the noise in my head. I was in the middle of a run when I felt it, that old, familiar prickle on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I scanned the crowded room and my heart seized. There he was, Sergeant Patrick Monroe. He wasn't in uniform, just gray sweats and a t-shirt, but he radiated the same chilling authority. He was standing near the weight racks, not exercising, just watching me with that familiar, critical gaze that stripped away all my competence, all my progress, and left me feeling like that clumsy 12-year-old girl again. He let me see him watch me for a full 5 minutes before he moved. He walked over and claimed the treadmill right next to mine, the hum of his machine a menacing intrusion into my space. We ran in silence for a few minutes, the only sound our synchronized footsteps on the moving belts. "Still weak, I see," he said, his voice low, pitched just for me to hear over the gym noise. "Don't disappoint me this time, Garza." Just like that, the air grew thin. The expansive, high-ceilinged gym suddenly felt like a cramped, suffocating box. My fortress had been breached. He hadn't just returned to my life, he had invaded my sanctuary. The scared 10-year-old girl I thought I'd left behind was clawing her way back to the surface, her panic making it hard to breathe. I finished my run, wiped down the machine with trembling hands, and fled. The invasion didn't stop there. It became more insidious, creeping into my life through the one thing I couldn't escape: my phone. A few nights later, at 2 a.m, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold. "Logistics report for EUO 800 needs to be perfect." There was no name, but I knew. Of course I knew. How did he even get my schedule? The next night, another one. 3:15 a.m., saw your light was on, get some sleep, soldiers need to be sharp. It was a digital leash. The messages themselves were innocuous enough to be deniable. On the surface, they looked like the words of a diligent, caring NCO. But I knew the real message. "I am watching you. I am always watching you. There is nowhere you can hide." Sleep became a stranger. Every buzz of my phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. My small, mint-green apartment, once my haven, now felt like a glass cage. I started double-checking the locks, drawing the blinds as soon as I got home, living under a constant low-level siege. My hard-won peace was eroding, grain by grain. The final assault came, as it always did, through my mother. She called me on a Saturday afternoon, her voice a syrupy, artificial sweet that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Hattie, honey, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Well, I was just talking to Patrick," she chirped, "and he mentioned you seemed a little stressed at work. He's worried about you, sweetie. He said he just wants to help you advance in your career and you have to be willing to accept his guidance." The practiced innocence of her words, the way she framed his stalking as guidance, made a hot, bitter anger rise in my throat. I couldn't hold it back. "Mom, he's not guiding me, he's harassing me," I said, my voice tight. "He's texting me in the middle of the night, he's following me, this isn't normal." There was a long sigh on the other end of the line, a sigh I knew all too well. It was the sound of my reality being dismissed. "Oh, Hattie, don't be so dramatic. You've always been so sensitive," she said, her tone shifting from sweet to weary and condescending. "Patrick holds a high standard for his soldiers, that's all. He's a respected sergeant. Just be a good soldier and listen to your superior officer. Make us proud." Make us proud. The call ended, but the conversation replayed in my head, each word a fresh stab of betrayal. She wasn't just a silent accomplice anymore. She was an active participant, his mouthpiece. She had taken my fear, my legitimate plea for help, and twisted it into a character flaw. I was the one who was too sensitive. It was a classic move from his playbook, and she had delivered it flawlessly. I was left with the bone-deep, soul-crushing certainty that I was utterly, completely alone in this. I sat there in the dark of my living room for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand, trembling. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. But then, something else began to stir beneath the fear. A different kind of cold. It was the cold, hard clarity of fury. My mother's words had been meant to break me, to force me back into submission. But they did the opposite. They severed the last, threadbare cord of hope I had that she might one day choose me. The illusion was gone. There was nothing left to lose. I thought of Brené Brown's words about courage. I thought of First Sergeant Alvarez's steady gaze and his open door. I thought of Tyler's quiet offering of a new meal. I thought of the warmth of Sarah's family at Thanksgiving. These memories were my life raft in the storm. They were proof that not everyone was like him, that I wasn't entirely alone. The trembling in my hands stopped. It was replaced by a steady, determined resolve. This was not going to be the rest of my life. I would not let him erase me again. I walked over to my laptop and opened it. The glow of the screen illuminated my face in the dark. I created a new folder on my desktop, encrypting it with a password he could never guess. I named it something boring, something he would overlook: equipment audit. Then I began to fight back. I took screenshots of every single text message, documenting the date and the time. I went into my phone settings and enabled the call recording feature. From now on, every word, every threat, every piece of guidance would be cataloged. This wasn't about revenge. This was about survival. He had declared war on my peace of mind, and I was done being a casualty. I was going to arm myself with the one thing he couldn't control: the truth. The Cold War of late-night texts and silent intimidation escalated a week later. Patrick announced a surprise competency evaluation for the entire logistics team. The focus, he declared, with a sweep of his arm across the cavernous warehouse, would be on handling heavy and oversized pallets. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a surprise evaluation, it was a custom-made trap, and I was the intended prey. He knew about my right shoulder, the one he himself had injured in a training demonstration years ago. It had never fully healed, leaving a lingering weakness, a dull ache that flared up under heavy strain. He knew my breaking point because he had created it. I stood there, watching the other soldiers take their turns on the forklift, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs. A small, cowardly part of me wanted to report sick, to find a way out. But the cold fury that had been simmering since my mother's phone call refused to let me back down. No more running. As my turn approached, I saw him subtly signal the forklift operator assisting the test. A small, almost imperceptible nod. The operator, a young private eager to please, loaded my pallet. I could see from a distance it was stacked higher, looked denser than the others. It was heavier than regulation allowed for a solo lift. The trap was set. My hands were slick with sweat as I climbed into the forklift. The warehouse felt unnaturally quiet, the usual cacophony of machinery and voices fading into a low hum. I could feel every eye in the room on me. I took a deep breath, trying to summon a calm I didn't feel. In my mind, I saw a verse from the small Bible my father used to carry, a verse he had underlined in red ink: "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" I engaged the hydraulics, the forks rising with a low whine. I eased the machine forward, sliding the forks under the pallet. I could feel the strain on the machine as I began to lift. The front wheels of the forklift bucked slightly under the excessive weight. My weak shoulder screamed in protest as I gripped the controls, trying to keep the load balanced. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had it. The pallet was a foot off the ground. Then, it shifted. A slight fatal tilt to the right. I tried to correct, but it was too heavy, the momentum too great. The entire pallet, loaded with heavy-duty vehicle parts, slid off the forks and crashed onto the concrete floor with a deafening, metallic explosion of sound. Silence. A total, suffocating vacuum of sound. In that silence, Patrick walked forward from the edge of the room. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a showman taking his final bow. He stopped in front of my forklift and looked at the mess on the floor, then up at me. He shook his head with a look of perfectly feigned disappointment. "Well, Garza," he said, his voice ringing out, loud enough for every soldier in that warehouse to hear, "I thought I trained you better than that." He let the words hang in the air, a public indictment of my incompetence. Then, he delivered the killing blow. "Your father would be so disappointed to see his daughter turn out to be this weak." His words struck a nerve so deep, so raw, that something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a slow fraying, it was a clean, sharp break. Hot tears sprang to my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. The fear I had lived with my entire life was incinerated in that single white-hot flash. I killed the engine, climbed down from the forklift, and walked until I was standing directly in front of him. I could feel the heat radiating from my own skin. I stood up straight, lifted my chin, and looked him directly in the eye for the first time without flinching. My voice trembled, but it was clear and carried across the silent floor. "Sergeant Monroe," I said, my words precise and cold. "My father taught me about honor. He would never use it to humiliate another soldier." The entire warehouse held its breath. You could have heard a pin drop. For the first time, someone had spoken back. Someone had challenged him. Patrick's face, for a split second, was a mask of stunned disbelief. Then a dark, furious red crept up his neck, flooding his cheeks. He was losing control, and he knew it. He recovered quickly, his military bearing snapping back into place like a shield. "Specialist Garza," he barked, his voice tight with fury. "My office, now." It was the command that had always worked, the one that sent me scurrying away in fear. But the fear was gone. "No, Sergeant," I said. My voice didn't tremble this time. It was steady. It was iron. "I will not be going anywhere alone with you. Ever again." He was momentarily speechless, his mouth opening and closing silently. I pressed on, the words flowing from a place of newfound strength. "Whatever you have to say to me, you can say it right here in front of all these witnesses." I paused, then delivered the final calculated checkmate. "Or we can discuss it in a meeting with First Sergeant Alvarez." I had invoked a higher power. I had drawn a line in the sand, not with a stick, but with the full weight of the chain of command he revered so much. His authority in this single moment was nullified. He was trapped. The entire platoon was watching, and I had just offered him a choice between public accountability and a meeting with his own superior. He stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. He was completely and utterly silenced. I held his gaze for one more second, letting him see that the person he had created was gone. Then, I turned my back on him. I walked away, my footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of the warehouse. I wasn't a victim scurrying away from a fight. I was a soldier, and I had just declared war. If you have ever had that one moment where you finally said, "Enough is enough," and stood up for yourself, hit the like button to stand with me. In the comments, just write one word: warrior. Let's see how many of us there are. My declaration of war in the warehouse left me with a terrifying clarity. I had publicly defied him, and there was no going back. The adrenaline from the confrontation carried me on autopilot, my feet moving with a purpose I hadn't felt before. I walked straight from the warehouse to the administrative building, my mind a blank slate except for one name: Alvarez. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I stood before his closed office door, my knuckles hovering for a moment before I knocked. The sound was too loud in the quiet hallway. "Come in," his voice called out. I pushed the door open. He was behind his desk, and the moment he saw me, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to a deep, knowing gravity. He stood, walked to the door, and closed it, the click of the lock echoing in the small space. "I saw what happened out there, Garza," he said, his voice low and serious. "Frankly, I've been waiting for you." Those 5 words broke through the dam of my composure. The story came pouring out, not just about the forklift, but about everything. The years of discipline, the ripped prom dress, the constant surveillance, the late-night texts, my mother's complicity. I laid the entire ugly map of my life on his desk. He listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, were filled with a profound empathy that made me feel, for the first time, like I wasn't screaming into a void. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, steepling his fingers on his desk. "Sergeant Monroe is a respected NCO. He has friends in high places," he finally said, his tone pragmatic. "Your word against his, even with your record, won't be enough. They'll bury it in paperwork. They'll call you hysterical, say you have a grudge. Specialist, do you have any proof?" That question was the turning point. I wasn't just a victim recounting her trauma anymore. I was a strategist presenting her case. I reached into the small pocket of my cargo pants and pulled out a single black USB flash drive. I placed it on his desk with a steady hand. "I have proof," I said, my voice firm. "Texts, call logs, and audio." He looked from the drive to my face, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in his eyes. He took the drive, plugged it into his computer, and put on his headphones. I watched his face as he listened. I saw his jaw tighten, his knuckles turn white as he gripped his mouse. He clicked on the recording of the call with my mother, then on another file, a call I had recorded with Patrick where he'd nonchalantly threatened to end my career if I ever stepped out of line. When Alvarez took the headphones off, the empathy in his eyes had been forged into cold, hard steel. This changes everything, he said, his voice a low growl. But we have to be smart. A direct report through the regular channels will get suffocated. Monroe will hear about it, and he'll crush it before it ever gets to anyone who can do something. We need to go around the chain of command. We need an outside trigger. He picked up his desk phone and dialed an extension. Yeah, it's Alvarez. I need a favor. Can you meet me? Off base. It's important. An hour later, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop in Fayetteville, a place called The Daily Grind. Alvarez walked in, and right behind him was the platoon medic, Tyler. My stomach tightened. Tyler looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot and avoiding my eyes. We sat, and Alvarez got straight to the point. Tyler, he began, I know what Monroe has been doing, and I know you've seen it. Tyler stared into his lukewarm coffee. First, Sergeant, I was scared, he finally mumbled, his voice thick with shame. He's a senior NCO. I have my whole career, my family. I understand fear, son, Alvarez said, his voice firm but not unkind. But there's a point where fear becomes complicity. Specialist Garza is doing the brave thing. The question is, are you? Tyler looked up then, and his eyes finally met mine. I saw the conflict there, the fear warring with his conscience. He took a deep breath. The first time he hurt you? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. In the combatives room. The report. He told me to write it up as minor bruising from accidental contact during training. He stood right over my shoulder while I typed it. I knew it was a lie. He looked back at Alvarez. I can't stay silent anymore. Whatever you need, I'll testify. I'll sign a sworn statement. I'm done being afraid. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost made me dizzy. It was the validation I had been craving for years. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't all in my head. Someone else saw it and was willing to say it out loud. An alliance was forming. Alvarez, with his rank and wisdom, and Tyler, a direct witness to the cover-up. Alvarez nodded, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Good man, he said to Tyler. Then he turned to me, his mind already working on the next move. Here's the plan, he said, leaning in. This can't be a disciplinary issue. It has to become a medical one. You need an undeniable, officially documented medical event, one that happens in front of witnesses and is serious enough to force an immediate evaluation outside the normal clinic. Something that triggers a mandatory report to CID. He held my gaze, his expression deadly serious. When that happens, and only then, you give this USB drive to the right person. An officer, a doctor, someone outside of his sphere of influence. Let the system that protects him be the very thing that traps him. He sat back, letting the weight of the plan settle. This next part is going to be dangerous, Garza. He's going to feel you slipping from his grasp and he will get reckless. You have to be ready. I thought of a movie I'd watched on a lonely night, the one about Erin Brockovich. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a fighter. She was underestimated, dismissed, but she never, ever gave up. There was a line from that movie that stuck with me. I looked at First Sergeant Alvarez, the fear still present, but the resolve stronger. I gave him a single firm nod. I'm ready, I said. I wasn't just Hattie Garza anymore. I wasn't just a victim. I was a woman with a plan, evidence, and allies. I was becoming a formidable opponent. Humiliated and enraged by my defiance in the warehouse, Patrick moved faster than I expected. He craved control, and having it publicly challenged had made him reckless. 2 days later, a mandatory force-on-force combat demonstration was announced. When the roster was posted, my name was right at the top, paired against him. It was his final, arrogant move. A public execution disguised as a training exercise. The entire platoon would be there to watch him put me back in my place. That evening, I got a call from a blocked number. It was Alvarez. "Garza, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice urgent. "Call in sick. I'll back you up. This is too dangerous." "First Sergeant, with all due respect," I replied, my own voice calm and steady. "He's expecting me to run. He's counting on it. This isn't just a trap anymore, it's an opportunity. I'm going." The morning of the demonstration, the air in the training hall was thick with a tension you could taste. I saw Alvarez near the back, giving a quiet, almost imperceptible nod to PFC. Evans, the young private who had tried to help me before. Evans subtly shifted his position, moving behind a stack of training mats, his phone held loosely in his hand. The stage was set. Patrick and I met in the center of the mat. He leaned in close as we assumed our starting positions. His voice a venomous hiss meant only for me. "You wanted witnesses, Garza? You got them. Let's see how brave you are now." The first few moves were textbook. A block, a parry, a controlled hold. He was playing with me, drawing it out for the audience. I could feel his frustration growing as I met each move, my body remembering years of his lessons. Then I saw the shift in his eyes. The performance was over. He moved with a speed that was pure malice. He feinted left, and as I adjusted, he brought his right knee up in a vicious, brutal arc, driving it with full force into the exact spot on my left side where he'd kicked me before. A sound, a wet, sickening crack, ripped through the air. It was louder, more final than the last time. A supernova of pain exploded behind my eyes, white hot and absolute. The world vanished. I was falling, but this time, it wasn't just a simple collapse. As my body hit the mat, I felt a strange sense of calm detachment. The physical pain was immense, a roaring fire in my chest, but mentally I was clear. I heard a small, satisfied grunt from him. I heard the collective gasp from the soldiers watching. And in my mind, a single cold thought surfaced. He took the bait. Patrick immediately launched into his old script, his voice booming with false concern. "It was just a collision. She lost her footing. Someone get the medic." Tyler rushed forward, aid bag in hand. But this was not the same hesitant, frightened medic from before. He knelt beside me, his movements efficient, but when he looked up at Patrick, his eyes were like chips of ice. "Sir, this looks like a severe rib injury, possibly a fracture," Tyler said, his voice clear and professional, carrying across the silent room. "Per protocol for a potential chest trauma, I need to transport her to Womack for a full workup and x-rays." Patrick's face darkened. The control was slipping. "I said take her to the clinic, medic. It's a bruise." Tyler slowly got to his feet, standing to his full height. He looked Patrick directly in the eye, a subordinate defying a senior NCO in front of 24 witnesses. "I'm sorry, Sergeant," he said, his voice unwavering. "But as the attending medic on the scene, this is my professional medical determination. She's going to the hospital." Check. Patrick was momentarily stunned into silence, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage. For the first time, his authority had been publicly challenged and overruled by a subordinate. He had lost control of the narrative. As the stretcher was brought in, I palmed the small phone in my pocket. My fingers, clumsy with pain, managed to type out a single prearranged message to Alvarez. 3 letters, INC, inbound. The ambulance ride to Womack Army Medical Center was a blur of pain. When we arrived at the emergency room, the controlled chaos was a welcome distraction. They got me into a trauma bay, and the flurry of activity began. Nurses, techs, and then a calm, authoritative presence. "All right, everyone, give me some space. I've got this." A woman in scrubs with captain's bars pinned to her collar stepped forward. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute confidence. She looked at my chart, then at me. "I'm Lieutenant Clark," she said, her voice both kind and efficient. "Let's see what we've got here, specialist." Just then, the doors to the ER burst open. Patrick stormed in with my mother Lisa trailing behind him, her face pale and anxious. "I'm Sergeant Monroe," he announced, trying to reclaim his authority. "I'm her stepfather. I need an update on her condition." Lieutenant Clark didn't even look up from her assessment. "And I'm her doctor. Right now, Specialist Garza is my patient and my only priority. You can wait in the waiting room." "Listen to me, Lieutenant," Patrick snarled, taking a step forward, trying to use his rank, his presence, to intimidate her. "That was a training accident, and I need to—" Clark finally looked up, and the look in her eyes could have frozen fire. She cut him off with the clean, sharp precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "In this hospital, my medical authority is absolute. Your rank means nothing here." She picked up a clipboard from the counter. "And based on the medic's field report and the visible contusions on my patient that are inconsistent with a simple fall, I am currently filling out Department of the Army Form 4106. She let that hang in the air for a beat. Patrick's face went white. He knew exactly what that form was. "It's a report of suspected assault," she continued, her voice like ice. "As per regulations, the moment I sign this, the military police and CID will be notified." She clicked her pen. Checkmate. In that moment, watching the blood drain from Patrick Monroe's face as his entire world began to crumble around him, the physical pain in my ribs seemed to disappear. It was replaced by something else. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt like winning. The aftermath of the ER confrontation was swift and decisive. As Lieutenant Clark had promised, the moment she filed her report, the world shifted. My case was no longer a private matter. It became an official investigation. The next morning, 2 CID special agents came to my hospital room. The lead agent was a man named Daniel Ruiz, a calm, methodical professional in civilian clothes whose quiet demeanor hid a razor-sharp focus. Lieutenant Clark, now acting as my medical advocate, was present for the entire interview. With the steady beep of the heart monitor as my metronome, I told them everything. I laid out the 16-year history of abuse, not with tears or anger, but with the cold, hard precision of a soldier giving an after-action report. When I was finished, I handed Agent Ruiz the black USB drive. He plugged it into his laptop right there in the hospital room. I watched his face as he reviewed the files, the timestamps on the late-night texts, the audio file of Patrick's threats, the video PFC Evans had taken of the final assault. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the laptop, removed the drive, and placed it carefully into an evidence bag. He looked up, and his eyes met mine directly. "Specialist Garza," he said, his voice even and direct. "I believe you." 3 simple words. But for me, they were the rain after a lifetime of drought. To be heard, to be seen, to be believed by someone in a position of authority, it was a validation so profound it left me breathless. It was the moment the ground finally solidified beneath my feet. But the battle was far from over. As the official investigation ramped up, Patrick's unofficial one began. He couldn't stop the CID, so he tried to poison the well. A smear campaign, insidious and ugly, started to spread across the base. The narrative was expertly crafted to paint me as the villain. Whispers followed me down hallways. "She's unstable, an attention seeker. She set him up to advance her career. It was just a tough training exercise. She's too sensitive." Soldiers who used to greet me with a friendly nod now averted their eyes. The isolation was a unique kind of pain. One morning, I woke up to find the word liar scrawled in black marker across my barracks room door. The physical ache in my ribs was nothing compared to the sharp, stabbing pain of that public shaming. It felt like the entire world was siding with him, just like my mother always had. I was sitting on my bed staring at the hateful word when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Maya Clark. "Hattie, when a corrupt system can't attack your story, it attacks your character. The fact they're fighting this dirty means you're winning. Stay strong." Her words were a lifeline. I took a picture of the door for evidence, and then I scrubbed the word off until my knuckles were raw. They could attack me, but I wouldn't let their labels stick. The preliminary hearing, the Article 32, was held a month later in a sterile, impersonal courtroom on base. It was there that I saw my mother for the first time since the hospital. She was called as a character witness for Patrick. She walked to the stand, her face pale, avoiding my gaze. At first, she recited the lines he had clearly fed her, repeating the training accident story, painting him as a dedicated, tough but fair leader. But under the sharp, relentless questioning from my appointed lawyer, a brilliant JAG captain named Rachel Kim, my mother's story began to unravel. Captain Kim didn't raise her voice. She simply presented facts. Then she pulled out an evidence folder. "Mrs. Monroe," Captain Kim said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'd like to show you a photograph." She placed an 8x10 photo on the projector. It was a picture of me on my 16th birthday, the one my mother had taken. I was standing awkwardly in that stiff, military-style outfit she'd bought me, my eyes hollow and sad, the ghost of a forced smile on my lips. "Do you remember this day, Mrs. Monroe?" Captain Kim asked. "Your daughter's sweet 16. She had saved her own money for a prom dress. Do you remember what happened to that dress?" My mother stared at the image of her sad, broken daughter projected on the screen. Her carefully constructed composure began to crack. Her hands trembled. "Mrs. Monroe," Captain Kim pressed softly, "is this what a mother's love looks like?" That was it. That was the question that broke her. A choked sob escaped my mother's lips. She looked from the photograph to me, her eyes finally meeting mine across the courtroom, and I saw 16 years of fear, regret, and shame finally break through the surface. She crumpled on the witness stand, her face in her hands, her body shaking with gut-wrenching sobs. "No, no," she wept, her voice muffled and broken. "He controlled everything. He told me he would ruin us both, that we'd have nothing. I was so scared." Her eyes, red-rimmed and pleading, found mine again. "I'm sorry, Hattie. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Mommy is so sorry." Her confession, raw and agonizing, sucked all the air out of the room. It was the complete and total demolition of the wall of lies Patrick had built around our family for nearly 2 decades. After the hearing concluded, with the investigating officer recommending a full court-martial, my mother waited for me outside the courtroom. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes puffy. "Hattie," she began, her voice hoarse. Can we please just talk? Maybe we can start over?" I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. The anger I had held for so long was gone, replaced by a vast, empty sadness. She was a victim too, in her own way. But that didn't erase the choices she had made. "Mrs. Monroe," I said, the formal address creating a sudden, necessary distance between us. Her face flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I forgive you," I continued, the words feeling strange and new on my tongue. "I forgive you not for you, but for me. I can't carry this anger anymore." A flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. "But," I added, my voice gentle but absolute, "I can't let you back into my life. My boundary begins here, today." For the first time in my life, I was the one closing the door. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her too-late apology. It was the most painful and the most powerful step I had ever taken. I was finally healing myself. The court-martial was a tense, exhausting affair. Patrick's defense attorney was slick and aggressive, painting a picture of me as a disgruntled, vindictive soldier with a personal vendetta. He twisted my dedication into obsession, my pain into instability. For 3 days, I sat there, a statue of composure, while he tried to dismantle my character, piece by piece. But character assassination is no match for irrefutable fact. The evidence Captain Kim presented was a fortress. PFC, Evans's shaky but clear cell phone video of the final assault played on a large screen, the sickening crack of my ribs echoing in the silent courtroom. Lieutenant Maya Clark and other medical experts testified with cold, clinical precision about the nature of my injuries. My mother's tearful testimony from the Article 32 hearing was read into the record, but the final nail in his coffin was his own voice. When Captain Kim played the audio file from my USB drive, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Patrick's voice, cold, arrogant, and dripping with menace, filled the space. I will end your career. The words hung in the air, an undeniable admission of his intent. He couldn't deny his own voice. He couldn't escape his own words. He was trapped in the web of his own making. The panel of officers deliberated for what felt like a lifetime. I sat at the defense table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, Maya's hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against my nerves. Finally, the panel filed back into the room, their faces grim and unreadable. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. We stood. The head of the panel, a stern-faced colonel, cleared his throat and looked directly at Patrick. "Sergeant Patrick Monroe," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "on the charge of assault, this panel finds you guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, this panel finds you guilty." A single, collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. I felt Maya's hand squeeze my shoulder, but I remained perfectly still, my eyes locked on Patrick. His face, once a mask of arrogant authority, had crumbled into a pasty, slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The sentence was delivered moments later. A dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, his retirement, his legacy, everything he had built, erased, and confinement at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth for a term of 8 years. 2 military police officers moved towards him. As the first metal handcuff clicked shut around his wrist, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room, I expected to feel a surge of triumph, of victory. But I felt nothing. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. It wasn't a celebration, it was just the end. A long, dark, painful chapter of my life was finally over. As they led him away, his eyes found mine one last time. The authority was gone. The power was gone. All that was left was the impotent, venomous hatred of a defeated man. I held his gaze, and then I gave him nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction, nothing. And I think for him, that was the worst punishment of all. The ripples from the verdict spread far and wide. The case became a catalyst for change. The story, published in a detailed feature in the Army Times, encouraged dozens of other soldiers, both men and women, to come forward with their own stories of abuse hidden under the guise of tough training. Within 6 months, the Department of the Army issued what became unofficially known as the Garza Directive, a new set of regulations mandating video recording of all high-risk physical training sessions and establishing an independent, confidential hotline for medical personnel to report suspected abuse of power by superiors, completely bypassing the normal chain of command. My legacy wasn't revenge, it was reform. It was a shield for those who would come after me. 1 year later, I stood on the main parade field at Fort Liberty. The North Carolina sun was warm on my face. I was in my dress uniform, standing in formation, but this time, I wasn't a victim, I was an honoree. When my name was called, I walked forward as First Sergeant Alvarez pinned the Army Commendation Medal to my chest for acts of courage and service. He leaned in, his voice a proud whisper only I could hear. "Your father would be so damn proud of you, Hattie." A tear I didn't try to stop rolled down my cheek. After the ceremony, I found a quiet bench overlooking the field. I took out a new, leather-bound journal. For years, my life had been a story written by someone else. Now, it was my turn to hold the pen. Inspired by women like Michelle Obama, who had turned their personal journeys into universal messages of strength, I had started to write. Not to dwell on the past, but to define my future. I had made a decision. I was staying in the Army, but I was changing my path. I had been accepted into a program to retrain as a behavioral health specialist. I was going to become a counselor, a support system for soldiers struggling with the invisible wounds of service. Patrick Monroe had tried to break me, to shape me into a tool for his own ego. Instead, he had forged me into a weapon for healing. He had inadvertently helped me find my true life's purpose. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the clean, pine-scented air of North Carolina. It had never tasted so sweet. For the first time, the silence around me wasn't empty or threatening. It was peaceful. It was possibility. It was mine. I had survived the long, dark night, And standing here, under the bright, open sky, I knew with every fiber of my being that I was finally creating my own sunrise. My story is finished, but I know that for so many of you listening, your own is still being written. The greatest lesson I learned is that your value is not determined by those who try to diminish you. It's forged in the moments you choose to stand up, to speak out, and to draw your own boundaries. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing. This channel is a space for stories like ours, stories of survival, resilience, and the incredible power of reclaiming your own narrative. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are the author of your next chapter.